All right, so this is going to be part 2 of the Pioneer SX-727 we were working on last week. In the event, you didn't see part 1 of the video. In that part, we basically just figured out that we had some spiking noise or static noise coming from one channel and isolated that down to one transistor, a 2SC1312. And then we figured out that this unit has about maybe 10 of those transistors scattered throughout the preamp tone control circuit. And so this part of the video, we're going to go ahead and swap all of those out just as a preventative maintenance for future issues that might arise from the same transistor. Everything seems to be okay in the tuner and in the main amp section, and so we're not going to worry with that. But in this part, we will go ahead and finish getting the controls cleaned up, get all the transistors replaced, and start working on the front panel, getting that nice and cleaned up and the knobs cleaned up, and see how nice we can get this thing looking after we get it working correctly. So we'll skip all the knob intros and all of that. We covered that in part 1, so we'll just get right into it after the intro music, which we're picking back up with the exact same album we were listening to last week, the 1971 release by Yes, just entitled the Yes album. And we're gonna hear one of my favorite songs by the band, no question about that, Starship Trooper. They have many versions of this song, this being the original one, but there's also an incredible version of this song on the band's album entitled Keys to Ascension. But we're going to listen to a little bit of the original one here, and then we'll get right back into the Pioneer.
Spoke to me in sweet accustomed ways.
All right, so as we come back in, one of the first things we're going to do is I'm going to finish cleaning up the controls here. And these are the push button switches that operate the tape monitor and various other functions. And we have excellent access through the back of these switches to clean them up. And what we're going to use to do that is what I always use, is the MG Chemicals Super Contact Cleaner. And you don't have to go nuts, just a little bit in each one of these. And then just kind of exercise the switch back and forth a few times. No big deal. And of course, we'll try all these before we put it all back together. These are kind of on a slope, so a cleaner will run to where it's supposed to be. If I can get some of it to come out of the can here. That's better. Better go back and hit the other ones here, just in case. And now for a little bit for the volume control. Let's see. control was actually pretty silent. We'll drop it down some here. And now the balance, I guess. And then bass and treble. Did I get those? I don't remember. Two stages to the bass and treble. And I had already previously done the selector switch because it was dropping out one side of the tuner. So we'll let that dry for a minute and then I'll pick back up with you and we'll start on the transistors. I already changed one down in this section just to see how that would be, and it wasn't a big deal at all. So give me a second and we'll pick back up and we'll start on the transistors in this area here. All right, as we pick back up here, before we actually start replacing the transistors, let's talk about the ones we're going to use for the replacement ones. First thing we'll do is we'll take a look at the original transistor that was in the unit, depending on how well the camera will agree, 2SC1312. And the ones we're using for replacements, a little smaller package. And again, the camera's having trouble kind of focusing, but 2SC1845. And I actually had these transistors in stock and didn't even know that I had them in stock because they were in the wrong drawer. So I must have been a little sleepy that night when I decided to cut these off of the reel of tape they were on and put them in the drawer. But we got a couple of things here we want to mention, or one thing in particular is the pinout of the original 1312 is base collector emitter, and the pinout of the 1845 is emitter collector base. So basically what you're going to be doing, whereas this transistor would be installed in the circuit board face forward due to its pinout, the new transistor will be installed basically opposite of that with the face to the back. And so it basically just inverts the emitter and base. So I'm going to go ahead and set you up overhead. And we'll go ahead and put one of these in this board here, and we'll go ahead and get that process started. Looks pretty good there. Let's go ahead and tag it in. Kind of left the leads a little bit long on that. Kind of the way they had the one from the factory. And I think the hardest part of this is probably just trying to deal with this circuit board kind of flopping around. I guess if I would have wanted to, I could have kind of stabilized it to where it wasn't moving around so much. And I'm going to trim these down just a little bit here. That should do it. There's that one, and then I'm going to go right behind and change the two caps. And then we'll put the two up here, replace those as well. And next, when I pick back up with you, we're going to go ahead and replace the ones on this board. And we're also going to remove the power supply board and check every cap here. And then we still have to deal with the heat sink that broke off on the lower transistor. And when I was checking this one to see how frail it was, it broke off too. And so I've already fixed it, but I'll show you my method that I used to do it. So I'll pick back up with you once I have this board completely done, and then we'll start on this one. So give me a moment for that, and we'll be back. All right, so we're going to pick back up just real quick. As it turns out, the two transistors at the top here, it wasn't only until after I removed them that I figured out that they weren't the C1312s that I originally thought they were. I couldn't really see the numbers on them. I just kind of made the assumption that they were. But as it turns out, they were not. There's also two other transistors up here. These are some old FET transistors. I knew those weren't the 1312s. But anyway, we got both of them replaced. I went ahead and changed both of the 2.2 mic capacitors there in the tone circuit. And before we even move on to the next thing over here, just wanted to kind of check it as we go along here, and it is working. So now that we've got all of that taken care of that we're going to do, I'm going to go ahead and get that board put back in, get it out of the way so it's not hanging there, and then we'll move on to the preamp board here and we'll get this started. So give me a moment for that and we'll pick back up. All right, as we come back in, let's take a quick look and focus our attention on this power supply board. One of the first things, when I removed the bottom of the unit, one of the first things I noticed was this small aluminum heat sink they mounted to this transistor right here was laying down in the frame. And the reason for that is they used a plastic screw on it. And of course, over time, that screw gets heated up and becomes brittle. And eventually, the head of the screw broke off and the heat sink just fell down into the bottom of the unit. This one over here was still attached, but I went ahead and did a repair on this one as well. And the way I did it is I did use a metal screw, but I used a screw hole insulator. There's a screw hole obviously in the transistor to mount it with, and I put a plastic insulator in that hole which isolates the screw from the body of the transistor. And what that does is just keep the heatsink isolated from the transistor. Now the reason they did that, I don't know. It doesn't look like this would come into contact with anything else on this board. I guess the only thing I can think of is they may have done that in an effort to prevent this from maybe coming into contact with the bottom of the unit. So anyway, I went ahead and put it back to where it is isolated. Now we're going to take a look at these capacitors on the power supply board here. And of course, there's probably an opposing opinion that would say, you should go ahead and change every one of these caps on this board. And that's all fine and good. You can do that if you want to. But from the standpoint of are the capacitors still good, we're going to be using this ESR meter, and this will give us a very good indication of whether or not the capacitors are still good. So we'll check the first two right here on the edge. Clearly there is no issue there. And by means of comparison, we'll take a look at one of the 2.2s that I pulled off of the tone amp board. And you can see that the ESR is creeping up on that one. And that was the reason why I decided to go ahead and replace it. This is still a usable capacitor, but it was definitely starting to be fatigued with age. So we'll go ahead and start taking a look at this one here in the center next. Again, burying the meter, and then the final two right here. And the last one. And so every single one of these on this board still very usable, still very viable. And of course, as I said, this is not a restoration channel. I don't do restoration work per se. But if someone owned this receiver and they wanted to change all these, there would be nothing wrong with doing that. But will these function as they're supposed to, as is? Absolutely. There shouldn't be any issue whatsoever with these capacitors. So we're going to leave those as is. We do have a hot spot right here with this resistor. I'm going to go ahead and touch that up with the soldering iron. We're going to put this board back in, and we're going to move on to the final thing we need to do on this board, and we're going to get on to doing a little bit of the cosmetic work on this. So give me a moment, and we'll pick back up. All right, so I'll pick back up with you now. I've kind of already started the process of swapping out all these transistors here. Made it through the first two, and also swapped out the sub transistor, the C2274, I think it was, that we put in here in part one to clear up the noise that we were having. So it was really just this transistor causing the problem, but just from the sake of preventative maintenance, we're gonna swap all of them. There's only 6 here, so no big deal. We won't do them all in the video here, but let's go ahead and at least do one more. And the only thing we really have to pay attention to here is the orientation of the transistor, because we know the original ones, the emitter and the base are inverted. So whereas the face of this one is kind of pointing out this way, we're going to flip the other one around to where the face is towards this transistor. So we'll use a little bit of solder wick and we'll get that one out of there. And the only thing that really makes this kind of cumbersome is the fact that we're trying to deal with this board just kind of dangling in space a little bit. But we should be able to do it. I went ahead and just basically resoldered all of the connections on the power supply board, and they were all a little bit, in my opinion, a little bit questionable. Nothing but the resistor that we were kind of looking at was the only thing that was really terrible, but there's a lot of current passing through that, so we'll go ahead and just take care of the whole thing. And back in the day, they had a tendency to bend leads over. If there was 2 components kind of right next to each other, they would just bend the leads over. That should be good enough to get it out. And I'll be taking a look at the orientation of this, and I think I have the other one all set and ready to go here. There we go. Now we'll just solder that up real quick. And since there's not that many transistors, I've just been kind of checking it as I go along, just to make sure I didn't get the pin out wrong or anything like that. We'll snip these off. Turn our signal tracer on, and let's see if we got a winner here. No trouble at all. That's working fine. So now that we got these 3 done, I'll go ahead and get the other 3 knocked out real quick. And then from that point, we'll start working on the face of this a little bit and getting ourselves in the ballpark. We're almost done. So give me a few minutes to finish these up and we'll pick back up. All right, so picking back up with you, went ahead and got all the transistors replaced, got the shield assembly put back over that. And the receiver sounds very nice. This is a very nice sounding receiver, very natural sounding, and you can tell that there's some power here too. Went ahead and just jacked in some bench speakers. We know we're good in the preamp now, so no worries about any kind of crazy spiking or anything going on. This is the end result. You got the 8 2SC 1312 transistors, and then of course the 2.2 at 25 volt caps that I changed in the tone circuit, and everything working good. All right, I think at this point we'll go ahead and get the front of the unit, the face piece, and start removing the lettering from that and getting that cleaned up. We'll get the knobs cleaned up and see what we can do about getting this thing looking as good as it sounds now. So give me a moment for that and we'll pick back up. All right, so as we come back in, already kind of started the process of working on the front piece here. One of the biggest things I was able to do last night is there were some white paint specks over here in this area, and I was able to get those off without any damage to the front here. But the biggest thing we want to do is remove these letters here that spell out laser with a Z. Obviously that's not something that came from the factory, and the customer wasn't aware of that. He must have got the receiver with this on it, and he wasn't schooled enough in these old receivers to realize this is obviously not part of it. So he does want this off, so we're going to go ahead and remove it. I found this one, the very first one, the L here, very poorly put on there, so it just came right off, and there's basically just some kind of self-adhesive type of sticker on the back of these. But the other ones feel like they're on there pretty good. So we have a little bit of a gap between the actual finish of the aluminum on the face, and so we're going to use a screwdriver just to kind of pry up on that a little bit. This is a metal screwdriver, but we're not actually touching this. We're putting this under the edge of the letter, and we're using the next letter next to it as kind of like the place to pry up. And we'll see how well this works out. Hopefully we don't do too much damage. Once we get it up, we can just kind of slowly peel it off, hopefully with no damage to the finish of the aluminum there. And it did come off. I realize my hand is kind of in the way, but you can see that it did come off there. And I didn't leave a pry mark on this aluminum, and of course this should clean up okay. Let's go ahead and see if we can get the Z. That one's a little tougher since I don't have an actual large straight edge, but it looks like it's going to come pretty good too. And that one came right off with no trouble whatsoever. And of course it's leaving a little bit of this sticky pad behind, which I'm just kind of taking off with my thumbnail. But at least we're not doing any kind of prying on the aluminum, leaving any kind of marks in the aluminum here. So now we get to the end and we have one left, and I don't have any way to pry up on it. So what we're going to do is we'll use one of these other letters as kind of the point to pry with. Let's see how well this turns out. go. Just kind of slowly working it loose. I don't want to fold it over because this being metal on metal, it would leave a pretty big mark there, I would imagine. So we're just kind of working with the sticky pad underneath and trying to get it freed up that way. There we go. So we did get it all off. There doesn't appear to be any scratches on here that were left from the removal process. So now it's just going to be a question of getting it all cleaned up. So I thought it would be fun for us to take these letters off on the video, since we all know, if you know anything about these receivers, you know that that was kind of a sore eyesore with those letters stuck on the front of this. So I'm going to go ahead and start cleaning this up. I'm going to go ahead and get it put back on the front of the unit. And we're going to do a final play test on this, and we'll be wrapping this one up. So give me a moment for that. All right, let's pick back up and we'll take a quick look at the unit with the face and the knobs all cleaned up and back on it. Also used the compressor, blew it out on the inside, wiped things down a little bit here. Of course, there is some flaws here with the cage. Turn it down a little bit. There is some flaws here on the cage. The unit was sitting in some area with a little bit of moisture in the air and got a little bit of rust on it, but nothing too terrible. I mean, if you take a look at this from a distance, and you don't have to be that far back, it looks great. Of course, under close scrutiny, you're going to find some flaws in this, but that's nothing abnormal. A lot of these have flaws in them. See that there? So, and down there where the lettering was, there isn't anything from where I was prying on it, but there's still some marks there. But for the most part, this don't look terrible. Based on what it looked like when we got it and based on what it looks like now, there's a world of difference. There is some type of, I don't know if that's pitting or what that is there, but it wouldn't come out with rubbing compound and it wouldn't come out with wiping it off. Looks like I missed maybe a white paint chip right there on the wood. But otherwise, this looks pretty good. And I really can't stress how great this thing sounds. It really does sound good.
Speak to me of summer, no winter's longer, and time can remember setting the bar on the road to travel on in old customs.
I even went ahead and took the cabinet and put a little Old English on it just for the finishing touch. Let's go ahead and put that on and we'll do a final play test on this one and wrap it up. All right, so we're going to pick back up one last time, having a look at this beautiful old SX-727 receiver. And we certainly were able to make some pretty big improvements in the sound and the way that it looks from when I received it here. Now, of course, we could have spent endless amounts of time and endless amounts of money doing stuff to this, but unfortunately, you're always working within the parameters of what your customer is willing to spend. And in this case, he basically just wanted the problem at hand taken care of and maybe a little cosmetic work. So we did a pretty good balance of the money we had to work with for looks and for sound. So I want to thank you guys as always. I appreciate you checking out the video this week and appreciate you all getting me over that 1,000 subscriber hump. Never thought we would ever make it to this point, but on our way out, let's check out a little bit more of this classic ES here, Starship Trooper. And again, thank you all. Appreciate it. We'll catch you next week.